Up, everybody? Welcome back to U.S. History. All right, I've thrown a lot of notes at you here the last couple weeks as we've started up quarter three. So the first week we were really looking at what was going on in Europe because, and let me backtrack for a second. If you think back to last quarter, when we were covering the 1920s and 30s, that's just kind of an era of American history where America was kind of practicing that policy of isolationism. We had kind of withdrew from the world stage, and we're really focusing on the 1920s are the good times. We're living it up here, and things are booming. The 1930s is the depression and the really bad times. So we're focused on getting people back to work and getting food on the table and all that. Well, the 1940s, it's going to be a foreign policy decade again, as you might have guessed. So I spent the first 2 weeks kind of covering the backdrop to the situation in both the theaters of the war. First week, we looked at what was going on over in Germany with the Nazis' rise to power. And then this week, we've really looked at what was going on out in the Pacific with Japan and them building up their empire. I wanted to catch you up to speed and kind of lay out the groundwork for all that. So remember, leading up to the Pearl Harbor attacks, this is like halfway through World War II. America still hasn't joined up in the conflict, but we're getting kind of pushed closer and closer to the side of the Allies as those fascist powers, the Axis powers, Germany and Japan primarily, are doing more and more rotten stuff. That's becoming more concerning to our leadership, to our president, FDR. And then finally, the Pearl Harbor attack, which is what I'm going to be covering today, that's the final straw, and it pushes America into the conflict. Once we get attacked, nobody's debating it anymore. Then public opinion flips from 98% of Americans wanting to stay out of the war to something like about 98% of Americans demanding we go to war and get revenge for those attacks. Now, really, the Depression actually goes right up to basically the Pearl Harbor attacks. The thing that jumpstarts our economy and really gets the American economy booming again is going to be us joining the war because millions of men get drafted up and are going to get shipped overseas to go fight. And then the government puts in massive government contracts to build tanks and planes and ships and everything else you need to fight the war. So that brings unemployment down to basically nothing. And everybody's working again and has some money in their pocket. So in a way, wars often do kind of boost the economy. So that might lead you to the question like, well, why the heck didn't we join the war earlier if it was going to boost our economy and make things better and kind of end the Great Depression? Well, I think it was really kind of two reasons. First is, as soon as we join a war, American men are going to die. And that's not popular with anybody. Even when we do join the war and people demand that we do after the Pearl Harbor attack, it still is upsetting and very concerning to people that a lot of American young men are going to die in this fight. The other reason is we didn't know that was going to boost our economy the way it did either. And the thing that happens here, remember, in the lead up to World War II, everybody owes America money. All right. America was a big crediting nation. But today, if you follow politics at all, America is in a tremendous amount of debt. And then with everything going on with COVID, the government's doing stimuluses and they're basically just printing more money and it's devaluing our currency and we owe more and more. And boy, that's a big mess. Well, actually, all of that starts back at World War II. We have been deficit spending and spending more money each year than we take in since World War II. So that was kind of the beginning of a national debt, us getting into the war. But enough about economics and politics. Now I'm going to tell you the story today, and this should be a pretty brief chunk of notes of what brought America into the war. Most everybody that comes into my class has heard of the Pearl Harbor attacks. That's a pretty epic thing in American history. I always say that usually about once a generation, something crazy happens, something really intense where the people, Americans, if you're old enough, you remember where you were and what you were doing when you heard this news, because you just it sears itself into your mind because this is going to change the world. Things aren't going to be the same anymore. Maybe with the COVID shutdowns when we were getting sent home last March, maybe that was one of those moments because I think that really did change our world. I think when I was younger, the 9/11 attacks, that's an example of one of those. President Kennedy getting assassinated in 1963. We haven't got to that yet in history, but that's one of those moments. And then I think a generation before that, the Pearl Harbor attacks were one of those events where people, that's my grandparents' generation, so probably like grandparents for you guys. But most of those old timers, if you talk to any of them, which I did growing up, they vividly remembered what they were doing and where they were at when they heard the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, because they knew, man, America getting involved into this big conflict, that's going to really change things. All right, so what I have behind me, and let me move my face here, a New York Times headline. This was printed, I think it was the day after the Pearl Harbor attacks, and newspapers across the country are running stories like this, and Americans are totally outraged that the Japanese, who we had kind of had a tense relationship with, but your average American had no idea what was going on behind the scenes, really. Like I said, the Depression's still going on, so most normal Americans are, man, they might catch a little bit of this on a newsreel if they're going into the theater, but people don't have TVs in their house yet. You might have heard a radio program or some news or read the newspaper and you get little updates about the war. But the average American, this really caught them off guard. They had no idea that Japan felt this threatened by America, and that because of us cutting off those oil shipments, that was going to trigger an attack like this. So it's shocking to the American people. And immediately we know that it's kind of that rally around the flag effect that, Americans kind of put their political differences aside and we unify and we mobilize together and get ready to fight and win this war. So the notes that you already have going on, I would probably skip a line or two and I'd put in like a big heading, America joins the war. And then next to that, you might want to even put like the Pearl Harbor attack. Okay, I'm not giving you a ton of notes today. I really only have one slide with text on it for you to write down, but there is quite a bit of stuff that you'll write down from that slide. And then after that, I'm going to go through and just show you a series of pictures of Pearl Harbor, so you really understand that fully. All right, so here we go. Let me shrink my face a little bit so you can see all the text up here. Okay, so with the Pearl Harbor story, remember, a little bit of recap from one of the last chunks of notes. America, is specifically like our leadership, our military heads up, and our president, Franklin Roosevelt, they were getting reports all over the place from what was happening in the war in Europe and what was happening with the Japanese out in the Pacific. We knew the Japanese were being absolutely rotten to the Chinese people and to the Korean people. I'm going to get into that more next week. Once we're openly at war with Japan, guys that are Americans that get taken as POWs, oh my God, the stories are just horrific. If you want to, and now I'm not going to get into a lot of details as to what the Japanese were doing to the Chinese people that they had conquered, but if you ever want to read some like very grisly and graphic accounts from history, go look up the rape of Nanking. Nanking is a very big city in China. Japan had invaded, taken that city, and I mean, there are just horrific stories, and literally millions of Chinese people are starved to death and murdered. Now, I don't cover a lot of that, and I don't get into a lot of the gory details there because this is an American history class, so I cover everything from an American perspective. So I will talk about the bad things that happened to American POWs, but not necessarily what was going on in other, like even like the Holocaust. That's a big thing. I spend a day or two on it, but really no Americans died in the Holocaust. It was European Jews and European communists that are being targeted. So I spend a little time on this stuff and mention it, but let me just say, if you're into Holocaust style things like events and those kind of stories interest you, and I think they are important to know so we can hopefully avoid things like that happening in the future, you should also very much look into what the Japanese were doing to the Chinese people, because it's a really horrific part of history, and I think it's on par with what happens in the Holocaust over in Europe. Okay, now a little more recap. Japan had remember, they wanted to be a self-sufficient empire. That was their goal, not to take over the world. They wanted to have their little bubble in East Asia and their half of the Pacific, and they wanted to have farmland to feed their people. They wanted to have minerals and natural resources, and specifically, they wanted to have an oil supply so that they could keep operating all their military equipment. Now, their problem was they had no oil up to that point in their empire, so they 100% relied on America to sell them fuel. Diesel fuel, gasoline, etc. And America also at the time basically had a monopoly on the refineries in the world. So really, we didn't produce or pump all the oil out of the ground in the world. That happened in different places, but we were the ones that refined it all and then would ship it out and sell it to everybody. When we cut off Japan's supply of oil, they do the estimates and they do have a stockpile built up, but they basically have 18 months of operating their empire left. And if they don't get a fresh flow of oil coming in after that, bad news. Nobody's going to have to defeat them on the battlefield. Their empire is just going to collapse because they can't operate any of their equipment. So we knew we were messing with them by cutting off that oil. But like from our perspective, our leadership is hearing all of these horrific stories coming out of China, all of these really, really rotten and mean things that the Japanese are doing to everybody that they conquered, and we don't like it. So we basically tell Japan, we'll start selling you oil again, but you have to withdraw from China. You got to knock this off. We're not going to sit by and just let you do it. And we weren't really ready to go to war with them over it. But we were absolutely ready to just, not make quite as much money off them and cut off the oil. Now, they perceive this as a grave threat. We were hoping they would just kind of have better behavior and they would withdraw from China. But the thing was, Japan at this point in history is addicted to empire. Politically, it was like not even considered to withdraw from China. It was just not an option at all. And Japan does have a really interesting kind of political situation going on there where their army and navy are kind of rivals and they almost like hate each other and don't work well together. And then there's factions in the political leadership. And then everybody looks up to the emperor, but the emperor really doesn't have a whole lot of control over everything that's playing out. So big mess over there, but just know that it was not even considered to withdraw from China. They're addicted to empire. They want their empire to expand, not contract. So they never seriously consider leaving China or freeing that stuff up just to start getting oil again. They feel like they only have one option. Their option is they're going to have to be a self-sufficient empire. They're going to have to take the Dutch East Indies that do have oil and build their own refineries, and that's the only option they have. We didn't realize they were quite looking at it like that. If we had, we probably would have been a little bit more well prepared for Pearl Harbor, but we're very much caught off guard. In the lead up to Pearl Harbor, so this is like a very short period of time after we had cut off these oil shipments, tensions are rising. Actually, America, and this is a key part, anything I have underlined here is stuff you should definitely know and you should put down in your notes in some way, shape, or form, so it'll trigger your memory later on. The Japanese didn't know this, but we had cracked their codes. So we could actually listen to messages that they were sending back and forth to each other. And then our coder guys would sit there and they'd, figure out what they said, and they'd give those reports and pass it up the chain of command. We basically knew an attack was coming, but they didn't give all the details in those messages because they were kind of worried. Well, what if somebody had cracked our codes? Now this was not known with the average American person, but FDR, our top generals and admirals, the heads up in the military, they knew Japan was essentially planning to attack America, but we had no idea when it was coming, and we had no idea where it was coming. And America has many, many bases out across the Pacific Ocean. So really, they had a lot of options. We never, ever thought that they would come. Like if you look at the map, and I'll show it to you in a minute, Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor is, the Hawaiian Islands, are closer to America than they are to Japan. Way closer. It's on our side of the Pacific. So we felt like if they were going to attack us, they were going to attack us out in the Philippines or Guam or one of these other bases that's over really close to Japan, which actually they did do that too. But we never thought that they would have had the backbone and the courage to come all the way to our side of the Pacific and hammer us in our most powerful naval base. So that very much catches us off guard. Now, I don't have you write down very many dates in my class, but I think the Pearl Harbor date is one worth you writing down in your notes. So December 7th, 1941, that's the day of the infamous Pearl Harbor attacks, and it actually crosses that international date line as these attacks are playing out. So for some of the other attacks they're doing, it's actually December 8th when the attack actually happens. But for our purposes, December 7th is when Japan does sneak attacks all across the Pacific on American bases and British bases. And man, they just unleash the fire and fury on us and catch both us and the British off guard. So Pearl Harbor is not the only place that gets attacked. They actually hit 4 other American bases at the Philippines, Guam, the Marshall Islands, and I'm drawing a blank on the other one. But really the only one that you would have to know for a test or quiz will be Pearl Harbor, because that is the hub, the base of operations for our whole Pacific fleet. And remember, America has a massive Navy. We have the second largest Navy in the world, but by the end of the war, we're going to hands down have the largest Navy because we can produce more ships than Great Britain. And America really is a country on the rise, and the British, they've been a sea power for a long time, but they're kind of on the decline, and they're really getting beat up bad by the Nazis at this point in history. Now, casualties there. What happens at Pearl Harbor? Now, remember, our guys are off guard. When you come into, if you were a sailor back in 1941, and your ship is out in the Pacific Ocean and you're coming into Pearl Harbor, think it's the Hawaiian Islands. What do you think of when you think of Hawaii? I know what I think of. It's a tropical paradise, beaches, and it's beautiful and all that, which is all very much true. So when sailors come in there, and remember, it's not a state yet, but it's a U.S. territory. It's closer to America than all the other Asian countries over there across the Pacific. Soldiers, or sailors, I should say, were not on high alert when they would come into Pearl Harbor. Their brain is like, man, we're on vacation mode. This is our time to get off our ship a little bit, go spend some of our money. We're going to go hang out and chase the girls at the bars and be at the beaches. So sailors literally celebrated when their ship would come in to refuel and restock at Pearl Harbor. Also, because it is a central hub naval base, a lot of the ships that were coming in were low on fuel, or they weren't stocked up with ammunition because they come to Pearl Harbor to get all stocked up. All right. So it makes a situation that if we don't expect an attack to come, they're going to catch all of our ships and military equipment way off guard, which is exactly what happens with the Pearl Harbor attacks. If we had decoded those messages a little sooner, they had more detail, or there were a couple things that happened that should have basically alerted us. If we had read those signals, our Admiralty would have sent the message out, and our ships would have prepared and loaded up all the guns and everything, and we could have put up a much better fight. We also would have sent all of our ships out of the harbor, because when they're sitting inside a harbor, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, they're all just lined up in perfect order. They're just waiting to be bombed. Whereas if you put them out into the ocean, well, then they're much, much harder to find, and they're all can be in different directions. So then those targets are really hard to hit. But in a harbor like that, where everybody's bottled up and contained together and nobody has their guns ready, that's a recipe for disaster. Now, many ships get sunk at the Pearl Harbor attack, but the ones that I'd want you to know are we have 9 battleships out there in the harbor this day, and 8 of them either get sunk or they get damaged so badly that they're just never going to be able to be used again. So after the attack, some of those ships that are beyond repair are going to be towed out into the ocean and scuttled. That's where we just sink our own ship because it's just junked. It's totaled. Now, the good news, 8 of our 9 battleships, that's a lot of really big ships we're losing. The good news is a lot of those ships didn't have their full crew. They didn't have, normally a battleship has something 800 or 1,000 guys on it. A lot of those guys, a lot of those sailors weren't on the ships because they were on leave. They were on the island actually and enjoying their downtime. So that's one thing that's, I guess, kind of good or went into our favor. The other good thing is all of these ships are old. They're from back in the World War I era. So most of them are outdated and they're kind of scheduled to be decommissioned. And America is in the process of always kind of building some new ships. So anyway, it's not the end of the world. And actually another kind of strategic little point here. If you go back to World War I and wars before World War II, battleships were the best ships in your Navy because those are the biggest ships with the biggest guns. They have the longest range. Those had been the decisive ships in most big naval battles up to this point in history. But now, between World War I and World War II, technology has advanced tremendously. All right. So World War I, all this new industrial age technology is coming out, like planes and tanks, combustion engines, but nobody quite knows how to use it. In the 20 years between the world wars, most everybody is figuring out how to use it now. And actually, the best ships in anybody's Navy are no longer going to be the battleships. They're actually going to be aircraft carriers, this new ship that can send planes up. The planes fly around and they drop bombs on the enemy ships way, way more effective, way, way more lethal than a battleship with big guns. Because think about it, one of these battleships with their massive cannons, they can shoot another ship maybe 25 or 30 miles away. They can fire shells that far, which is pretty far. But an aircraft carrier can send planes up and they can go strike ships hundreds of miles away. And they can send their planes out in different directions. So a far more effective naval weapon. Now, before any fighting took place in World War II, most of the smart Navy guys around the world, they still thought battleships were the most important ship. And the aircraft carriers, they're just kind of a new little toy we're playing with. But a few other naval battles had happened prior to this, where the British were fighting the Japanese and the Germans. And man, the British and Japanese had both realized by this point in the war that aircraft carriers are where it's at. That's going to be the decisive ship in naval warfare moving ahead in the future. So actually, a very key point, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, we got really, really lucky on this. I want you to write this into your notes, and I don't have this little detail on here. So for those of you that are actually watching and listening and not just looking at what I had on the slides and skipping through, you're going to get a bonus answer here. America at the beginning of World War II only had 4 aircraft carriers in our Pacific Fleet, okay? Big, massive ships. They're bigger than the battleships. They're they're the size of Michigan Center High School almost, and they have 1,000-man, actually I think a couple thousand-man crew in some cases. America only has 4 of them, and the thing is, even once we get into war, by the end of the war, America's going to have a lot more aircraft carriers. But by this point in the war, even if once the Japan attacks us and we are mobilizing for war, and remember, we can produce way more stuff than Japan can. The problem is we can make a lot of aircraft carriers, but even when you try to make them really quick, it's still going to take almost a year period from start to finish to make one of those ships and get it battle ready. So if they sank all our carriers, that was going to severely handicap our fleet in the Pacific, and we wouldn't have been able to go on the offensive for several years. Now, just through sheer luck, I mean, this is the best part from the American perspective of the Pearl Harbor attack. All 4 of our aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that day. They were all out to sea, so they're all saved. So a huge strategic point there that I want you to know and I want you to have in your notes. Their number one goal was to get all of our aircraft carriers. Essentially, like their pilots were told, the bigger the target, the better the value. So because none of the aircraft carriers were there, they start bombing the battleships because those are the next biggest ships in line there. Anyway, all 4 of our aircraft carriers were out to sea that day, so none of them got sunk. That was a huge silver lining for us, and it's going to let us go on the offensive much more quickly than Japan anticipated. But in addition to the 8 battleships that Japan destroyed, they sink a ton of cruisers, destroyers, and they end up killing 2,400 American servicemen and some civilians that they actually bombed the hospital. So that's kind of a rotten thing to do, to drop a bomb on a hospital, that's in civilian territory. And they ended up destroying 200 planes. Now, the good thing is here, the planes and the ships that they did destroy were all outdated. So even moving ahead into the war, America was going to start producing new, more modern stuff immediately. All of those ships and all of those planes, within about a year, were going to be phased out anyway. So it sucks to lose all that stuff. But on the other hand, I guess if you're going to lose stuff, you might as well lose your old stuff rather than your new things like the aircraft carriers. In contrast, Japan didn't lose one ship. Now, their whole fleet, I think it never got closer than 300 miles to Pearl Harbor. So think their ships are way, way out in the ocean. They don't want to get too close because they're worried they'll get their aircraft carriers sunk. They're worried that they were going to get their ships sunk. So they send 3 waves of planes was the plan. They only end up actually sending the first 2 waves of planes because after the first 2 waves of their planes come in and torpedo and bomb American targets, they've already caused so much damage. They don't think a 3rd wave would really be that beneficial, and they would have probably just lost more planes and pilots. So in the whole attack, they don't lose one ship, and they only end up losing 29 planes. So super lopsided from just stats and nuts and bolts perspective. It is a very decisive win for Japan. They cripple our Pacific Fleet. They kill a lot of our guys. They take out a ton of our planes, and they lose almost nothing because they can replace those 29 planes quite easily. All right, moving ahead now. Now, here is an aerial image of Pearl Harbor. Why is it that harbors would be really important? And they still are today. Actually, to this day, Pearl Harbor is still the main base of operations for the American Navy out in the Pacific Ocean. Remember, we go back to one of my first lectures from the year talking about the Spanish-American War and the annexation of Hawaii. We had been using this base, this harbor, for a long time to house our ships. Remember, the Queen of Hawaii tried to kick us out of there, and then there was the fruit farmers did the little revolution, and that's how we took Hawaii and annexed it inside America, made it kind of our territory. Well, this gives you a pretty good image here. Here is the harbor from a very high aerial view. Out at the very top, if you're following my cursor, that's the Pacific Ocean. Now, a logical question for you might be, if you don't know much about like naval warfare and stuff and harbors, why couldn't we just build docks to refuel our ships right out there on the Pacific Ocean? Actually, you could most of the time, but here's the thing. Once in a great while, and it might be once every year or maybe even every couple years, there's going to be big storms that come and hit. Or there's going to be an earthquake on the other side of the ocean, and that earthquake starts a wave and it becomes a tsunami, one big wave coming across. Now, if you build your docks out on the exterior of the island, once in a great while, one of those tsunamis or a massive storm is going to come through, and it's going to take your massive ships and throw them up on the beach. Well, when you get a 300-ton ship or more up on the sand of a beach, you ain't never getting it off of there. So it would ruin your ships and stuff when a storm would hit. However, if you have a natural occurring harbor like this, you can take your ships inside the harbor, and there might be a massive tsunami or a huge storm going on out there, and the ocean has 20-foot waves coming, and it's really choppy waters. But actually, inside the harbor, it'll be relatively calm and stable in there. So that's why Pearl Harbor is just naturally a great place to house your ships, to refuel them and resupply them. All right. Next up, here's another image, and it just shows you how these ships would come into the docks. They line up nice in a row, and they're refueling them, restocking them. The guys are getting off a little time off of the ship, getting their break. That's kind of, an average day out in Pearl Harbor, kind of what's going on out there. Here are some images that started to get snapped after the attacks. Unfortunately, I don't have really any good images for you while the attacks are going on. Because, think if this happened today, we would have all kinds, an almost infinite amount of images, because today everybody has a cell phone with a camera and they're recording everything. Back in 1941, nobody had cameras unless you were literally walking around with a big bulky camera, like you're a tourist taking pictures. Nobody was walking around with cameras. So while the attack's going on, people are freaking out and running for cover. Nobody was thinking to take pictures. But after the attack dies down and the planes are gone, then people start snapping pictures of the aftermath of it all. It makes me think of almost like the 9/11 attacks, where you see these big columns of smoke going up into the sky. A couple more images for you. Now, a few images were snapped as this was all going on. Like here's one of the ship blowing up, where somebody just happened to snap a picture of that at the right moment. In addition to hitting our ships out in the harbor, Japan also, with their second wave of planes that came in, they targeted the airfields further inland. Hawaii has several different air bases there too, in addition to the naval base. So most of our planes were there. Like the pilots would go to Hawaii to get trained. These guys were practicing and learning to fly. So we didn't have a lot of combat ready pilots ready to rock and roll that morning. And most of the planes weren't loaded with live ammo, and a lot of them weren't even fueled up. They were just sitting out on the tarmac, so they were very easy targets. Now, we did have a handful of planes that were fueled up and did have bullets in them, and actually I have a movie clip that I'll be showing you next week, and you'll see it kind of shows a handful of our pilots did get planes up in the sky, and that's kind of how most of the 29 planes that got shot down of the Japanese planes, it were those handful of American pilots that were ready to go. Last image I got for you today. Here's President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, and he's standing at the podium in front of a joint session of Congress. This is the next day, and he is giving his Day of Infamy speech, which I might end up having you read that, or we might listen to a little bit of it. I actually have a cool movie clip that I want to show you. And the very last part of the scene is an actor playing FDR, and he delivers that speech like word for word. So pretty iconic presidential speech from American history, but unanimously Congress says we are going to war after this. It was no longer a controversial thing whether we're going to join the Allies or not. Now America, 100% after the Pearl Harbor attack, the American people demand revenge. We are going to war, but we're going to have some strategic questions as to how do we go about winning this war? And that's where we'll pick up next time. All right, have a good day.